The lecture hall of Seralith Prime Academy stretched wide like a shining crescent of metal and glass. Sunlight filtered through the great observation dome, scattering across rows of seats filled with cadets from many different worlds. Tall insectoid. Scholars clicked their mandibles as they adjusted holoscreens. Winged students from the airy planets folded their wings neatly as they scribbled notes. Amphibious learners from water worlds hummed softly as they studied diagrams projected in the air. Every seat seemed full of chatter and life except one. Near the center of the hall, a long row of curved benches formed a semicircle. On one bench, a young cadet named Lyriel sat alone. She always sat alone. The seat to her left was empty, as was the one to her right. The cadets around her leaned ever so slightly away, not obviously, but enough to show the distance they wanted to keep. Lyriel tried not to notice. She unfolded her datapad and stared at the glowing blueprint on it, pretending to review energy flow equations. Her dark, smooth skin reflected faint light, and her 4 violet eyes moved quickly across the page. But inside, her mind was not on the equations. It was on the silence that wrapped around her like a shadow. Her people, the Zarethi, carried a heavy burden of history. Long before Lyriel was born, before even her parents' time, the Zarethi had stood on the wrong side of a galactic war. They had fought fiercely, cleverly, and stubbornly, leaving scars on the memory of other species. Though the war had ended, centuries ago the distrust lived on. No matter how many times her teachers told her the past did not define the future, the whispers of her classmates proved otherwise. Never trust a Zarethi, she had once overheard. They only build to destroy. Why is she even here? Her jaw tightened as she tapped her datapad too hard, nearly closing the file. She breathed in slowly, trying to center herself. She had sworn to herself that she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would study harder, build better, and prove that she belonged. But belonging was difficult when even the seat beside you remained empty. The doors to the hall opened with a hiss, and the sound of heavy boots echoed on the polished floor. Heads turned. A new student walked in, carrying a thick toolkit slung across his shoulder. He was human, the cadets murmured among themselves. Humans were rare in the academy, not because they lacked talent, but because their kind was still relatively new to galactic society. The species had only reached the stars a few centuries ago, and though they spread quickly, few humans chose the long years of training required for elite academies like Seralith Prime. The human's name was Daniel Reeves. His hair was dark and a little untidy, his uniform slightly wrinkled and his stride unhurried, as though he had walked into a small classroom rather than one of the most prestigious halls in the galaxy. The instructor, a towering Vril with crystalline skin, introduced him briefly. "Cadets, this is Daniel Reeves of Earth. He will be joining your engineering lectures." Daniel gave a short nod. No bow, no nervous shifting, no attempt at charm. Just a nod. He scanned the rows of seats, toolkit still resting on his shoulder. Lyriel's hands froze on her datapad. She felt her stomach tighten. She knew what would happen next. The new arrival would look for an open seat. He would glance at the one beside her. Then, like everyone else, he would decide against it. He would move somewhere else, anywhere else. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He walked straight down the row and dropped into the seat right beside her. The seat that had been empty since the first day she had arrived. The seat no one else had ever dared to take. The hall went quiet. Lyriel's 4 eyes widened slightly, though she forced her face to remain calm. She expected him to look at her, perhaps to smirk or make some kind of comment. But Daniel said nothing. He set his toolkit at his feet, pulled out a small slate of notes, and began reviewing them as though the silence in the room did not exist. The whispers started almost immediately. She heard them, sharp as needles. Why sit there? Doesn't he know? The Zarethi. But Daniel didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. The lecture began. The instructor's voice echoed across the hall as holodiagrams flickered to life in the air. Circuits, reactors, energy flows, starship designs. Lirel tried to focus, but her attention kept drifting to the man beside her. He wrote quickly in his notes, his handwriting sharp and mechanical. At times he tilted his head slightly, as though running numbers in his mind faster than he could write. Humans were strange, she thought. She had read about them. They were called reckless by some, stubborn by others. They had spread through dangerous sectors of space where few dared to go, carving settlements out of barren rocks and frozen worlds, and now one sat beside her as though it meant nothing. When the lecture ended, cadets began to rise and gather in groups. Daniel remained seated, adjusting something in his toolkit. Lirel considered leaving quickly as she always did, but curiosity pressed against her silence. Finally she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You know who I am, don't you?" Daniel looked up. His eyes were brown, direct, with no trace of hesitation. "Yeah," he said simply. "Lirel, right? Blinked. "And you still sat here." He shrugged, tightening a strap on his toolkit. Seat was open. Lirel stared at him, searching for hidden meaning, for mockery or challenge. But his tone was flat, casual, as if he truly meant what he said. A seat was open, so he sat. Nothing more. For a moment she felt something unfamiliar stir inside her chest. It was not full trust. Trust took time, but it was lighter than the weight she usually carried. As the hall emptied, Daniel slung his toolkit back over his shoulder and walked out without another word. He did not look around for approval, nor did he explain himself to anyone. He simply left, leaving Lirel staring after him. That night, as she returned to her quarters, the whispers followed her in the corridors as always. But they felt different now. For the first time, she wondered if the empty seat beside her might no longer stay empty. Lirel lay awake in her bunk later, staring at the ceiling where the faint hum of the station's engines vibrated. She thought about the human, his calmness, his indifference to the judgment of others, his choice. So small, yet so loud. He doesn't even know what it means, she thought. Or maybe he does. And he just doesn't care. Her people had long been chained to a reputation they could not escape. She had accepted that truth the way one accepted gravity. But Daniel's single action had shifted something, like a sudden change in orbit. The Academy would talk about it, she knew. They would whisper louder than before. But for once, the whispers did not make her feel smaller. They made her feel noticed. For the first time since she had arrived at Seralith Prime, Lirel closed her eyes with the faintest trace of hope. Because no one had ever sat beside her, until the human engineer did, without a word. The Academy halls always hummed with life. Metallic footsteps echoed, voices overlapped, wings fluttered, and data pads beeped with constant updates. Yet within all the noise, a quiet tension was growing. The moment Daniel Reeves, the human engineer, had taken the seat beside Lirel, whispers had spread like sparks in dry grass. Some cadets laughed at the absurdity. Others sneered, whispering that humans were too naive to understand history. And a few, though very few, watched silently with something like curiosity. Lirel noticed it all. She had grown sharp at sensing stares, at reading the small movements of those around her. Every time she entered a room now, she felt the shift in air. Heads turned, voices dropped. For years she had walked invisible, avoided and forgotten. Now, thanks to one human who had not even spoken a full sentence to her, she was impossible to ignore. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. Lab assignment. 2 days after Daniel's arrival, the cadets gathered in the engineering lab for a practical test. The lab was wide and filled with half-built reactors, exposed circuits, and floating holo displays. Each student was given a workstation, though most formed quick groups. The task was simple in design but difficult in execution. Stabilize a miniature, anti-grav array, and keep it running smoothly for 5 minutes. Pairs will be allowed, the instructor announced, his crystalline skin shimmering under the lights. Work wisely. Remember, an unstable array will collapse violently, though we have dampeners to protect you. Around the room, cadets moved instantly toward their usual partners. Groups of 2 and 3 clustered together, already dividing the work. Lyriel stood still. She knew better than to move. No one would call her. She bent her head, preparing to work alone again when a familiar sound reached her ears. Heavy boots. Daniel dropped his toolkit beside her station. "Guess we're working together," he said. Her 4 violet eyes blinked. "You could choose someone else," she replied quietly. "Could," he agreed. He didn't move. The words were simple, plain, without drama. But his decision was final. Lyriel exhaled slowly, adjusting her datapad. "Fine, let's begin." First test. The small anti-grav array was a cube no larger than a head, glowing faintly blue at its edges. Inside, layers of energy plates had to spin in harmony to cancel out gravity's pull. If the balance faltered, the plates would crash against each other and burn out. Lyriel reached for the main console. "I'll handle calibration. My people are skilled in precision work." Daniel crouched beside the array, opening his toolkit. "Good. I'll check the structural housing. Looks flimsy." She shot him a small glance. Most cadets, when paired with her, resisted her taking the lead. They doubted her judgment. But Daniel had accepted her words without hesitation. She tightened her grip on the console. The array whined softly as it activated. Numbers scrolled quickly on the display. Energy currents wavered dangerously. Lyriel's hands moved in smooth motions, adjusting the flow, bringing it into balance. Beside her, Daniel fastened stabilizing brackets, reinforcing weak joints with steady, quick hands. For a moment, the machine trembled, light flickering in unstable bursts. A hiss of worry swept through the room as other cadets glanced over. Then, stability. The glow evened out. The plates spun in smooth rhythm. Daniel grinned. "Not bad." Lyriel's lips twitched into the smallest smile before she quickly looked back to the display. "We still need to keep it steady for 4 minutes." Interruption. 3 minutes in, the array jolted. Sparks burst from one side, making Lyriel flinch. Someone had tampered with their station. She turned her head sharply. A group of rival cadets stood nearby, pretending to focus on their own project. Their smirks gave them away. "They overloaded the side feed," Lyriel hissed. Daniel didn't even look at the rivals. He simply grabbed a cable, stripped it with his teeth, and forced it into the housing. "Bypass it. I'll keep the casing from frying." Lyriel's hands flew over the console, adjusting the rhythm. Daniel pressed his shoulder against the shaking machine, using sheer strength to hold it steady as she rerouted power. The machine's glow flickered, then steadied again. The instructor's crystalline eyes glimmered with quiet approval. Around the room, the whispers began again. When the timer ended, the array powered down smoothly. Lyriel and Daniel's station was one of only a few that had survived the full 5 minutes. A quiet moment as the cadets left the lab. Daniel bent to collect his toolkit. His movements were casual, as though nothing unusual had happened. Lyriel walked beside him, her voice low. "Why didn't you report them?" He looked up at her. "And waste time arguing when the array was about to blow? Not my style." She studied him for a moment. "You trusted me to fix it." "You were already fixing it," Daniel said simply. "I just gave the machine a shove." She almost laughed. Almost. But the sound caught in her throat, rusty from disuse. Instead, she said, "Most wouldn't trust a Zarethi to touch an unstable system." He met her gaze without hesitation. "Then most are fools." Her 4 eyes widened slightly. She had no answer. The watching crowd. By the end of the week, the academy was buzzing. The story of the lab incident had spread. Some cadets sneered, claiming Daniel was reckless for sitting with Lyriel, working with her and defending her skill. Others grew curious, watching more closely. During lectures, Lyriel no longer felt invisible. Her isolation was broken, though not always kindly. Stares followed her wherever she went. One evening in the mess hall, she carried her tray to her usual quiet corner. Daniel was already there, sitting casually with a plate piled high with food. Without hesitation, she sat across from him. The hall went silent for a breath. Then voices rose again, louder than usual, buzzing like insects. Daniel didn't look up from his meal. "You always eat alone?" "Yes," she answered. "Not anymore." He shoved an extra roll toward her. She blinked at it, then at him. Slowly she accepted it. Small sparks in the days that followed, little moments piled up. During one lecture, when a holodisplay failed, Daniel and Lyriel instinctively moved together to repair it before the instructor even called for help. There, hands moved in sync, her fine adjustments matching his quick improvisations. During another exercise, when a rival cadet mocked her heritage loudly, Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply turned, met the cadet's eyes, and asked, "Got a better idea? No? Then sit down." The mocking stopped. For Lyriel, each moment felt strange, almost fragile. For so long she had walked alone, carrying the silence of distrust. Now here was someone who treated her isolation as though it were meaningless. He didn't defend her with speeches. He didn't try to explain himself. He just acted, steady, certain, and unbothered by the weight of history. It was confusing. It was unsettling. But it was also hopeful. End of part 2 that night. As she sat in her quarters, Lyriel replayed the lab test in her mind. The sparks, the shaking machine, the calm way Daniel had trusted her. For the first time in years, she felt her skills had been seen not through the lens of her species' past, but through her own hands. The academy had not changed. The whispers were still there. The distrust had not vanished. But there was a new sound now, softer yet stronger, the steady rhythm of a partnership beginning to form. The first sparks had been lit. The weeks passed quickly on Seralith Prime Academy. Every day was filled with challenges, lectures, labs, and drills. For most cadets, the academy was a place of competition. Each student wanted to prove they were the best, to climb the rankings, and to secure a place in the galaxy's future. For Lyriel, the academy had always been a place of survival. She had learned to stay quiet, to work alone, and to endure whispers. But ever since Daniel Reeves, the human engineer, had arrived, things were no longer the same. The empty seat beside her was no longer empty. The silence around her was no longer complete. And though whispers still followed her, she no longer carried them alone. But change did not come without resistance. The announcement. One morning, the crystalline instructor entered the hall with unusual energy shimmering across his body. His voice rang clear, carrying a hint of excitement. "Cadets," he said, "the annual engineering challenge will begin next week. As you know, this is no ordinary exercise. It is the test of teamwork, creativity, and endurance. You will be tasked to build a functioning shuttle capable of surviving a simulated plasma storm." The hall erupted in noise. Cadets leaned toward each other, forming teams immediately. Everyone wanted strong partners, those with quick minds and steady hands. The instructor raised a glowing hand. "Teams may be as small as 2 or as large as 5. Choose wisely. A poorly balanced team will fail. A team without trust will break under pressure." At once, groups began to form. Voices called out. Names were exchanged. Data pads flashed with requests. Lyriel stood still. She did not expect anyone to ask her. She had already decided she would work alone if needed. Then she felt the familiar thud of heavy boots. Daniel stopped beside her desk, toolkit slung across his shoulder. "You in?" he asked casually. Her 4 violet eyes blinked. "With you?" "Yeah." He tilted his head as if it was the most obvious choice. "You're the best at energy harmonics. I'm decent with structures and power distribution. We'd make a solid team." She hesitated. Around them, cadets were already staring, whispering again. The idea of working together was bold, too bold. Teams were watching, ready to laugh if they failed. But Daniel's steady gaze gave no space for doubt. "Yes," she said finally. "Good." He set his toolkit down with a heavy clank. Then it settled. Doubt and mockery. By the next day, the academy buzzed with talk. Cadets laughed openly in the halls. "The human picked the Zarethi?" One scoffed. "They'll be the first to fail," another said. "She'll ruin the build. He's wasting his chance." Lyrael kept her head down, but each word was sharp. She had endured whispers before, but now the pressure was heavier. This was not just her reputation. Daniel's was tied to hers. If they failed, it would not only confirm what others believed about her people, but it would also drag him down. One evening, as they sat in the workshop surrounded by scattered parts, she finally spoke. Her voice was tight. "You don't have to stay with me. You could join another team. You'd do better." Daniel looked up from the circuit board he was fixing. His face was calm. "You really think I'd walk away after choosing you?" She lowered her eyes. "I don't want to destroy your chances." "You won't," he said firmly. "You know why? Because you're good at this, better than most of them." His words were simple, without decoration, but to Lyrael they were heavier than steel. The design. The project rules were strict. The shuttle had to be built from raw materials supplied by the Academy. No outside tech, no shortcuts. Every system had to function. Most teams followed traditional designs, reinforced shields, heavy plating, and layered energy cores. They copied what had worked in the past. But Daniel and Lyrael thought differently. Daniel sketched rough diagrams on a slate. "Everyone's going to build tanks. They'll try to endure the plasma storm by brute force, but plasma doesn't care about armor. It slips through, melts circuits, overloads shields." Lyrael studied the sketch. "Then what's the alternative?" "Flexibility," Daniel answered. "Instead of resisting every strike, the shuttle should bend with the flow. Like humans say, don't fight the river, ride it." She tilted her head. Strange words, but energy can be tuned to harmonize with plasma currents. Instead of resisting them completely, we could redirect them around the shuttle. He grinned. "Exactly. You handle the harmonics. I'll build the frame to take the stress." Together they began building something unusual. A shuttle not built like a wall, but like a dancer. The struggle days passed in sweat and frustration. The workshop echoed with the sound of hammers, the hum of welders, the spark of circuits. Lyrael calibrated energy cores until her eyes ached. Daniel reinforced the skeleton of the shuttle with clever supports, turning scraps of alloy into strong joints. Sometimes they argued. Daniel's human improvisation clashed with Lyrael's precise calculations. "That angle will destabilize the flow," she snapped one evening. "And your perfect equation doesn't care that we don't have enough parts," he shot back. For a moment the silence was sharp. Then Lyrael exhaled, rubbing her temples. "We must find balance." Daniel's shoulders dropped. "Yeah, balance." Slowly, they learned to blend their styles. Her precision guided his improvisation. His creativity filled the gaps in her equations. Piece by piece, the shuttle began to take form. The Mockery Grow's rival teams often stopped by their station to mock. One insectoid cadet clicked his mandibles in laughter. "That thing looks fragile. It will shatter in the first wave." A winged cadet added, "You should have joined us, human. At least we would give you a chance at victory." Daniel didn't even look up from his work. "We'll see." But Lyrael felt the sting. Every insult pressed heavier on her shoulders. She knew the risk. If they failed, the Academy would not only laugh, it would confirm every prejudice. Still, when she saw Daniel's steady focus, she forced herself to continue. The simulation day at last, the day of the engineering challenge, arrived. The cadets gathered in the large hangar where several shuttles stood ready. Some were bulky, armored like fortresses. Others gleamed with polished plating. And in the corner stood Daniel and Lyrael's shuttle, sleek, strange, almost fragile compared to the rest. The instructor's voice rang out. "The test will begin. Each shuttle will face the plasma storm. Only those that endure will pass." One by one, shuttles launched into the simulation chamber where swirling plasma clouds crackled with deadly light. The first shuttle lasted less than a minute before its shields overloaded. Another managed 3 minutes before its hull split. A third Survived longer, but sparks soon consumed it. Then it was Daniel and Lyriel's turn. They strapped in side by side. Lyriel's 4 eyes focused on the energy display. Daniel gripped the controls. The shuttle entered the storm. At once, plasma waves struck like lightning, slamming into the shields. The ship shuddered, light flaring dangerously. Lyriel's hands moved quickly. Redirecting flow, hold steady. Daniel adjusted the controls, guiding the shuttle to tilt with the currents instead of resisting them. She's holding. Keep it balanced. Plasma crackled across the hull, but instead of tearing through, the energy curved away in shimmering arcs. The shuttle moved like a dancer in the storm, bending, twisting, flowing with the strikes. Minutes passed. 1, 2, 3. The storm grew stronger. Rivals watching from the hangar leaned forward, expecting failure. But the shuttle held. 4 minutes. 5. The glow of the harmonics hummed steady, balanced perfectly by Lyriel's hands. Daniel's controls guided the ship smoothly through each wave. When the storm finally ended, the shuttle emerged battered but intact. Silence filled the hangar. Then the instructor spoke, voice ringing with rare pride. Successful. Aftermath. When they landed, Daniel leaned back, grinning. Told you we'd make it. Lyriel looked at him, breathless, her chest tight with emotion she didn't quite understand. For the first time in her life at the academy, she felt victory. Not stolen, not tainted, but earned. As they stepped out of the shuttle, cadets stared. Some in disbelief, some in quiet respect. A few even nodded, though grudgingly. The whispers had not vanished. But something had changed. Lyriel walked beside Daniel, her steps lighter than before. For the first time, she felt that perhaps the seat beside her would never again be empty. The victory in the engineering challenge had shaken the academy. For weeks, cadets had whispered that Daniel and Lyriel would fail, that their strange shuttle design would collapse in the storm. Instead, it had glided through the chaos while stronger ships fell apart. The result was undeniable. Lyriel and Daniel had succeeded, but success brought new weight. Shadows of resentment. At first, the change seemed positive. When Lyriel walked into lectures, some cadets who had once turned away now met her eyes. A few even nodded politely. Instructors began calling on her more often, no longer passing over her as if she didn't exist. Yet not all responses were kind. Rival teams, humiliated by their failure, turned their frustration into sharper whispers. She only succeeded because of the human. The Scifi always ride on someone else's back. Next time she won't be so lucky. Daniel ignored the talk. He carried on with the same calm steps, sitting beside Lyriel in every hall, working with her in every lab. To him, their victory was simple. They had worked hard, blended their skills, and earned it. But to others, it was a challenge to their pride. A warning one evening, after lectures, Daniel was stopped in the corridor. A group of cadets blocked his way. 3 tall insectoid students and a winged one with sharp golden eyes. Their stares were unfriendly. Human. One of them clicked. Why do you stay with her? Daniel raised an eyebrow. With who? You know who. The winged cadet sneered. The Scifi. She'll drag you down. If you care about your reputation, you'll leave her side. Daniel adjusted the strap of his toolkit on his shoulder. His voice was calm, steady. She's the best partner I've ever worked with. If that bothers you, maybe you should try building better instead of talking. The words cut through the corridor like a blade. For a moment, no one spoke. The cadets' wings twitched in frustration, but Daniel didn't flinch. He simply stepped past them and walked away. Hidden around the corner, Lyriel had heard everything. Her chest felt tight. She had expected him to brush off their insults with silence. Maybe even laugh it away. But he had defended her openly without hesitation. She did not know what to do with the weight of such loyalty. The crisis. The academy was not only a place of learning, it was also a functioning orbital station. Its systems stretched through long corridors, reactor lines, and shield generators. Students studied engineering not only in theory but in the living structure around them, and sometimes the station reminded everyone that learning carried risk. It began with a distant tremor. Lyriel was in her quarters when the floor vibrated softly beneath her feet. At first she thought it was a routine system test, but then alarms wailed across the station, their sharp cries echoing through the halls. "Impact detected," a voice announced over the speakers. "Meteor cluster breach, outer shields failing." Lyriel rushed into the corridor, joining the flow of cadets running toward safety zones. But in the distance, she saw Daniel moving against the crowd, heading toward the engineering sector. She froze for half a second, then followed into the storm. The engineering sector was chaos. Red lights flashed, systems sparked, and the deep hum of the reactor wavered dangerously. Cadets and staff rushed back and forth, trying to contain the damage. A meteor fragment had pierced the outer shield and struck the reactor lines. If the Yao systems failed completely, the Academy could tear apart in orbit. Daniel threw his toolkit onto the floor, already pulling out tools. "We need to stabilize the secondary line before it overloads." Lyriel appeared at his side, her hands flying over the console. "The flow is destabilizing. If it collapses, the reactor will cascade. Then we don't let it collapse." His eyes met hers briefly. "You in?" She nodded. "Always. Working together." They dove into the heart of the chaos. Sparks showered them as they pulled open panels, revealing glowing energy conduits. The heat was intense, sweat rolling down their faces. Lyriel's 4 eyes tracked the wild numbers racing across the display. "The surge is rising 30% above tolerance." "Then reroute it," Daniel shouted, tightening a coolant valve with both hands. "I can't. Too much resistance." Daniel yanked a heavy cable free and shoved it toward her. "Use this. Bypass the damaged line." Their hands moved in sync, weaving precision with raw strength. Lyriel's mind raced through equations, adjusting the flow with sharp, exact commands. Daniel's arms strained as he forced stubborn systems back into place. All around them, cadets stared. Many had frozen in fear, uncertain of what to do. But here were 2 students, one human, one Xerithi, working together as though they had been partners for years. The reactor roared, shuddered, then slowly began to stabilize. The collapse. Just as they secured the final line, another tremor shook the station. A larger meteor had struck, tearing a hole in the outer hull of the engineering sector. Air roared out in a violent rush, pulling tools and papers into the void. Lyriel staggered, nearly pulled off her feet. Daniel grabbed her arm, anchoring her with his weight as emergency barriers slammed into place, sealing the breach. The air returned to stillness, heavy with the sound of their breathing. "Still with me?" Daniel asked, his grip steady on her arm. She nodded quickly, her chest pounding. "Yes, I'm here." The turning point hours later, the crisis was over. The meteor cluster had passed, the shields were restored, and the reactor lines were stable. No lives had been lost thanks to quick action. When the cadets gathered in the main hall, instructors praised the engineering teams. And though many had worked bravely, the story spread quickly. How Daniel and Lyriel had rushed into the chaos, how they had stabilized the reactor when others froze. The whispers changed again. They saved the station. Together. Maybe the Xerithi isn't like the stories. For the first time, respect outweighed suspicion. A conversation. That night, Lyriel sat on the observation deck, staring at the stars through the great dome. Her heart was restless. She had spent years believing she would always be alone, marked by her heritage. Yet here she was, not only respected but chosen, again and again by a human who had no reason to stand by her. She heard the sound of boots and knew without looking who it was. Daniel dropped into the seat beside her, as always. They sat in silence for a while, the stars glowing like distant fires. Finally, Lyriel spoke softly. "Why? Why do you stay? When others tell you to leave, when standing with me makes you a target, why?" Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. "Because I don't choose teammates based on gossip. I choose them based on skill. And because you've Never let me down. Her throat tightened. You make it sound simple. It is simple. He glanced at her. Sometimes people make things harder than they need to be. For a long moment she could not answer. Her 4 eyes shimmered faintly in the starlight. In that silence, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just trust anymore. It was something deeper, a bond forged in fire and storms. End of Part 4. The Academy had been shaken by their victory. It had been tested by the meteor storm. And through it all, Lirel and Daniel had stood side by side. The whispers had not vanished completely, but their meaning was no longer the same. Where once they carried mockery, now they carried awe. For Lirel, who had once sat alone, the weight of loneliness was gone. The breaking point had come, and instead of breaking apart, she had found someone who refused to let go. The station had quieted after the meteor crisis. Life returned to its usual rhythm. But something fundamental had shifted for Lirel. The Academy no longer felt like a place of shadows and whispers. She walked through corridors with a new awareness. Not arrogance, but presence. She had been tested, challenged, and for the first time she had emerged not just surviving, but respected. And she knew she was no longer alone. A changed Academy cadets who had once ignored her now glanced her way with cautious respect. Some even sought her advice in the labs. The instructors had begun assigning her to lead small groups, trusting her judgment and skill. Lirel had learned to balance this newfound attention, aware of the lingering prejudice but refusing to be defined by it. Still, the whispers had not completely stopped. There were those who doubted, who judged, who believed old stories mattered more than actions. But they mattered less to her now. Daniel remained a steady presence beside her. He never boasted, never claimed credit, never sought attention. He simply continued to work, to speak plainly, and to trust her. Their partnership had become unspoken yet undeniable. Cadets around them began noticing how naturally they complemented each other. The humans' improvisation paired with the Xerithi's precision, brute strength softened by careful calculation, daring grounded by logic. Together they were more than the sum of their parts. The next challenge weeks later, the Academy announced another competition, a fleet coordination exercise. Teams would be tasked to guide multiple shuttles through a simulated asteroid field, while maintaining communication, energy efficiency, and structural integrity. For most cadets, this was stressful. Coordination required trust, planning, and quick thinking under pressure. One small mistake could ruin the whole team. Lirel and Daniel accepted the challenge immediately. No one else asked them. They were already recognized as a strong pair, and others assumed they would naturally succeed. As they prepared, Lirel's mind raced through calculations and simulations. Daniel reviewed structural schematics, making adjustments for weight distribution and speed. Their notes overlapped seamlessly. "You're sure about this trajectory?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I trust your numbers. I'll guide the shuttle. You guide the energy flow. Like we always do." She nodded. They had found a rhythm over weeks of collaboration, a silent understanding that didn't need explanation. Into the field. The exercise began in the hangar, shuttles lined up like birds ready to take flight. Their craft was small but swift, flexible yet durable. As it lifted off and entered the asteroid field simulation, Lirel adjusted energy flows to protect the shields. Daniel maneuvered with steady hands, weaving the shuttle through spinning, rocks, and simulated debris. Other teams struggled immediately. One shuttle collided with an asteroid, its shields flashing red before failing entirely. Another miscalculated the trajectory, sending their shuttle spinning off course. Lirel and Daniel moved as one. Lirel's 4 eyes tracked energy spikes across multiple systems while Daniel adjusted thrusters and stabilizers with instinctive precision. Time stretched and contracted in the field. Each second was critical. The human's calmness balanced her careful urgency. Each decision was measured, deliberate, yet adaptable. They did not hesitate. The moment of doubt. Halfway through the simulation, a sudden asteroid swarm descended faster than anticipated. The shuttle shook violently. Lyriel's console lit up with warnings. Flow overload, shield stress, energy drain. She froze for just a second. The flicker of fear passed through her mind, a shadow from old years when mistakes cost lives, trust, or safety. Daniel noticed immediately. "Focus on the pattern," he shouted. "The flow is unstable only in spikes. Redirect them as they arrive." She took a deep breath, her hands moving in precise harmony with his guidance. The energy streams bent around the shields, absorbed, then released safely. The swarm passed. The shuttle glided steadily. "Good," Daniel said simply, glancing at her. Her chest swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. She had trusted someone fully before, but this was different. This was partnership under pressure. Victory, quiet, but true. The exercise ended successfully. Their shuttle completed the course intact, maintaining all systems perfectly. Other teams had failed or barely survived, their simulations showing minor to severe malfunctions. The instructors nodded in quiet approval. Lyriel and Daniel had demonstrated not only skill, but teamwork and trust, qualities the Academy valued most. Cadets in the viewing area whispered, impressed now, though many still tried to hide it behind polite smiles. As the simulation lights dimmed, Lyriel felt a strange warmth, a sense of belonging she had never known. She looked at Daniel. He gave her the smallest smile, the kind that carried no words but said everything. She understood perfectly. Recognition. A few days later, the Academy held a small ceremony. Certificates of merit were awarded, and instructors praised cadets whose performance had stood out. When Lyriel's name was called alongside Daniel's, the applause was genuine, enthusiastic. She stepped forward, her 4 eyes bright. Daniel followed, calm, steady, his presence grounding her. The hall was full of cadets who had once ignored or judged her. Now, they watched in admiration. One of the rival cadets whispered to another, She actually earned it. And he didn't just help, he worked with her as equals." Lyriel didn't look at the whispers. She looked at Daniel and nodded, a simple gesture that carried a world of thanks. He shrugged lightly. "We did it," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "We did it." The seat no longer empty. That evening, as the Academy quieted and most cadets returned to their quarters, Lyriel found herself walking to the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly above the station. She had always loved the quiet of the cosmos, but now it felt different. She wasn't alone. Daniel followed without speaking, dropping into the seat beside her, just as he had the first day he arrived. For a long while they sat in silence, watching distant lights flicker. No words were needed. Silence had become part of their bond, comfortable and affirming. Finally, Lyriel spoke. "You've never sat anywhere else." He shrugged. "Why would I?" Her lips curved in the smallest smile. "I used to be alone," she admitted softly. "Not anymore," he said. She looked out at the stars. The galaxy was vast, full of wonder and danger, and full of people who would judge her based on history she could not change. Yet for the first time she felt a simple truth. She had allies, she had friends, and she had one human who had chosen to see her not as a Zarithi marked by history, but as Lyriel, the engineer, the problem solver, the one who could stand beside him in storms and challenges alike. And that was enough. New beginnings. The days that followed were not without challenges. The Academy continued its lessons, drills, and competitions. Some cadets still whispered, some still doubted. But Lyriel faced them differently. She no longer carried the weight of isolation. She had learned to trust, to act boldly, and to stand tall regardless of prejudice. Daniel remained beside her, not as a savior, not as a protector, but as an equal partner. Their skills complemented, their courage combined, their bond strengthened. In The mess halls, in the labs, in the lecture halls, Lyral no longer walked alone. She had someone who believed in her without question, who chose her every day without needing to explain why. And sometimes, that was more powerful than any victory, more lasting than any recognition. The last scene one evening, after the last lecture of the week, Lyral returned to the observation deck. The stars shimmered through the great dome, the distant planets glowing softly. She sat down and waited. Soon, Daniel appeared, as always, toolkit tucked away, calm and steady. He dropped into the seat beside her. No words were spoken. The quiet stretched between them, comfortable and full of meaning. Lyral rested her hands in her lap, letting herself breathe. The academy no longer felt hostile. The whispers no longer held power over her. She was strong. She was capable. She was no longer alone, and for the first time she allowed herself to truly believe it. The galaxy was vast, the future uncertain, and life full of challenges. But she had a partner she could trust, and that was everything. For the Zarethi who had once sat in silence, the empty seat beside her had been filled, not by words, not by explanation, but by a human who had chosen to sit, to stay, and to stand beside her without question, and that simple choice had changed everything.